There is a city in the American desert where more than 1.5 million people live, and almost every single one of them drives over an ancient civilization on the way to work. They do not know it. There is no sign. There is no monument at most of these places. There is just a bridge, and under the bridge there is a channel of moving water, and that channel is following a line that somebody scratched into the ground more than 1,000 years ago using a stick. Phoenix, Arizona, one of the fastest growing cities in the United States, a place that looks brand new. Glass towers, wide roads, endless suburbs, swimming pools, golf courses, all of it sitting in one of the hottest and driest places in North America. A place where, in summer, the ground can get hot enough to cause serious burns in seconds. A place that on paper should not be able to feed anybody, and yet the water flows. It has been flowing for a very long time. Here is the part that should stop you. When the settlers arrived in this valley in the 1800s, they did not build a canal system. They did not have to. They found one. It was already there, cut into the desert floor, running for miles in every direction, dry and choked with brush, waiting. Somebody had already solved the hardest engineering problem in the valley. Somebody had solved it centuries earlier, without metal tools, without the wheel, without a single work animal, and without anything we would recognize as a surveying instrument. And then that somebody had gone. The settlers looked at those empty ditches and they understood immediately what they were looking at. They understood they had walked into the ruins of something enormous, and when it came time to name the town they were building on top of it, they chose a name that admitted it out loud. They named it after a bird that dies in fire and comes back out of the ashes. They named it Phoenix because they knew they were the second city on that spot. The question is, what happened to the first one? And the answer is stranger and darker and far more impressive than almost anyone who lives there today has ever been told. Let me take you back. The year is 1867. A man named Jack Swilling is riding through the Salt River Valley. He is a rough character even for the time. A former Confederate soldier, a prospector, a man who has been shot and beaten and never fully recovered from either, and who by most accounts is not in good shape. He is not a scientist. He is not an explorer. He is a man looking for a way to make money. He is on his way through the valley to somewhere else, and he stops, because he sees something in the ground that does not make sense. Long shallow depressions, running dead straight for enormous distances, cutting across the flat desert with a kind of confidence that nature does not have. Banks of raised earth on either side, softened by centuries of wind but still clearly there, grown over with mesquite and creosote but unmistakable. Swilling knows what a ditch looks like. He has dug plenty, and he understands, standing there in the heat, that he is looking at a canal. Not one canal, a network, dozens of them, branching and rejoining, spreading out from the river across the entire valley floor. And he does the math in his head, and the math is very simple and very profitable. This valley can be farmed. Somebody proved it. All he has to do is clean out the channels somebody else already dug and let the river back in. That is exactly what he did. He went to a nearby mining town, raised money, formed an irrigation company, brought a crew back, and started clearing out the ancient ditches. Within a year, there was wheat growing in the Salt River Valley. Within a few years, there was a town. Within a lifetime, there was a city. Every single person in Phoenix today is downstream of that decision. But Swilling never answered the question that was lying right there in front of him. Who dug them? Where did those people go? Why would anyone build something this large, this carefully over this many generations, and then walk away from it and leave it to fill with sand? He did not know. He could not have known. The tools to answer that question would not exist for another 70 years. We know now, and the answer starts with a scale that most people simply do not believe when they first hear it. But before the numbers, you need to understand what these people were up against, because otherwise the numbers will not mean anything to you. The Sonoran Desert gets somewhere around 7 or 8 inches of rain in an average year in the Phoenix area. To put that in perspective, corn needs roughly 2 to 3 times that much to produce a decent crop. So on rainfall alone, farming there is not difficult. It is impossible. It is not a matter of working harder or choosing better seed. The water simply is not in the sky, and the rain that does not fall helpfully. It arrives in 2 bursts, a little in the winter, and then the summer monsoon, which does not soak in gently, but comes down in violent storms that run straight off the hard desert surface, tear through dry washes, and are gone in hours. Meanwhile, the heat is doing the opposite job. Summer temperatures regularly pass 110 degrees Fahrenheit, which is well over 40 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, open water evaporates fast. Soil dries out within a day, and a plant that is not being actively watered is finished. So the desert offers you two things and takes away a third. It gives you sunlight, which is the one thing crops in colder places are always short of. It gives you a long growing season, long enough that in a good year you can take 2 harvests off the same ground. And it withholds water completely, which means the entire question of whether human beings can live in that valley in large numbers comes down to a single problem. Not soil, not climate, not disease, water delivery. The river is right there. The Salt River runs through the middle of the valley, carrying snowmelt down out of the mountains to the east. The water exists. It is just in the wrong place, in a channel below the level of the land you want to farm, moving past you and out of the valley. Solve that one problem, and the desert flips from the worst farmland in North America to some of the best. 2 crops a year, no frost to worry about. Sun forever. Fail to solve it, and nothing else you know how to do matters at all. They solved it, completely, and they did it at a scale that is genuinely difficult to picture. Let me put some numbers on this because the numbers are the whole story. In the Phoenix Basin alone, archaeologists have mapped hundreds of miles of ancient canals. Some estimates for the wider region, when you count every branch and every field ditch, run past 1,000 miles of dug channel. 1,000 miles. That is roughly the distance from Phoenix to Kansas City, except folded up and packed into a couple of river valleys in the desert. The largest main canals were not little irrigation trenches either. The biggest of them ran something like 30 feet wide and up to 10 feet deep. Stand in the bottom of one of those and the desert disappears. You would be looking at walls of packed earth well over your head, and that channel would run in an almost perfectly straight line for 10, 15, in some cases more than 20 miles before it reached the fields it was built to feed. The amount of earth moved to do this runs into the millions of cubic yards. Millions, moved by hand. And now here is the part that breaks people's brains a little. They had no metal, not for tools, no iron shovels, no steel picks, nothing that would hold an edge against packed desert caliche, which is a layer of natural cement that forms under the soil in dry country, and which is genuinely difficult to break with modern equipment. They had no wheel, no carts, no wheelbarrows, nothing that rolls. They had no draft animals, no horses, no oxen, no mules. Those animals did not exist in the Americas at that time. Every ounce of that soil moved because a human being picked it up and carried it. What they had was stone hoes, wooden digging sticks, and baskets. That is the toolkit. A pointed stick to break the ground, a stone blade lashed to a handle to cut and scrape, and a woven basket to carry the dirt out on your shoulder or your back. With that toolkit, over many generations, they built the largest irrigation network anywhere in the ancient Americas north of Peru. It is one of the largest hand-dug irrigation systems anywhere in the ancient world, full stop. And digging it was not even the hard part. Here is the hard part. Here is the thing that, when you understand it properly, changes how you think about these people entirely. Water has to go downhill. That sounds obvious. It is obvious. But it is also a trap. And it is the trap that has killed irrigation systems all over the world for thousands of years. If your canal drops too steeply, the water moves too fast. Fast water is not gentle. Fast water rips the bottom out of your channel, scours the banks, undercuts everything, and within a season or two your beautiful canal is a broken gully full of debris, and your fields are dry. If your canal drops too gently, the water moves too slowly. Slow water drops whatever it is carrying. In a desert river, that is a huge amount of silt and sand. Slow water fills your canal from the bottom up, quietly, a little every year, until one day the channel is level with the ground and nothing flows at all. So there is a narrow window, a very narrow window. Your canal has to fall at just the right rate the whole way over its entire length, or it destroys itself. For a canal running many miles across the desert, the correct drop is roughly 1 foot for every mile. 1 foot per mile. Think about what that means. Over the length of a mile of desert, they had to control the elevation of the channel bottom to within a matter of inches. Then do it again for the next mile. And the next, 15 miles out from the river. 20, holding that grade the entire way across ground that is not flat, that has rises and dips and old flood channels crossing it. Now do it without a level, without a transit, without a theodolite, without any of the optical instruments that a modern surveyor would consider the absolute bare minimum for laying out a channel like this. How, we do not know for certain, and anybody who tells you they know for certain is guessing. But archaeologists have some very good ideas, and all of them come down to the same thing, which is patience. One method is simply water itself. Water is a perfect level. It will tell you instantly and honestly which way the ground falls. So you dig a short section, you let a little water in, you watch what it does and you correct. Then you dig the next short section. You are not surveying the route in advance. You are letting the river survey it for you, one piece at a time over years. Another method involves sighting along staffs or poles held at fixed heights, one person walking ahead, one person sighting behind, moving the line forward step by step. It is slow, it is crude, but it works and it is accurate enough if you are willing to check it and check it again. And they clearly did check, because the canals hold their grade. We can measure them today, and the engineering is sound. There are places where a modern canal built with modern instruments runs within yards of an ancient one, on effectively the same line, because there was only ever one correct line and they had already found it. That is worth sitting with for a second. Modern engineers, with laser levels and satellite data and computer modeling, looked at that valley, calculated the best route for a canal, and arrived at an answer that a person with a digging stick had arrived at more than 1,000 years earlier. But there is something else here. Something that has nothing to do with engineering, and it is actually the more remarkable fact. A canal 20 miles long cannot be built by a family. It cannot be built by a village. It requires hundreds of people working together for years on a project that will not feed a single one of them until it is finished. And once it is finished, it requires them to keep cooperating forever. Because a desert canal silts up, every year, the flood season dumps sand into the channel, and every year that sand has to come out by hand, by basket, along the entire length of the system. If the people at the top of the canal decide to stop maintaining their section, everyone below them starves. If the people at the bottom decide the work is not worth it, the whole thing degrades anyway. So this network is not just a feat of digging. It is proof of a society. It is proof of organization, of agreement, of some system for settling arguments about water that held together across dozens of villages and hundreds of years. I want you to picture what that actually looked like, because it is easy to say the word maintenance and let it slide past you. Every year after the flood season, the canals are partly full of sand. Not a light dusting. In a bad year, feet of it. And the only way that sand comes out is the same way the canal went in. People walk down into the channel with baskets and stone tools in a desert, and they dig it out and carry it up the bank and dump it. And then they move 10 feet down the line and do it again for miles. Nobody is being paid. There is no machinery coming to help. And the person doing that work in the middle section of a canal is doing it for the benefit of people further down who they may only see a few times a year. Now add the arguments, because there are always arguments. In a dry year, when the river is low and there is not enough for everyone, who gets water and who does not, the village nearest the intake is physically holding the tap. They could take everything. Nothing stops them but agreement. That is the part we cannot dig up. We can map the channels precisely. We can date them. What we cannot excavate is whatever system these people used to look at a low river and decide year after year, generation after generation, that the village at the bottom of the canal still gets its share. Whatever that system was, it worked for something like 1,000 years. That is longer than most empires. It is roughly 4 times longer than the United States has existed. And it left almost no trace because trust does not fossilize, which means when the canals eventually failed, something else had failed first. Hold on to that. We are coming back to it. So who were they? Here is where I have to be careful and honest with you because the name itself contains a piece of the story. Archaeologists call this culture the Hohokam. That word is not what they called themselves. We do not know what they called themselves. Their language, if it was written, was not written in anything that survived. The word Hohokam comes from the Hohokam language, spoken by the native peoples who live in that part of Arizona today. The original word is closer to Hohokam, and the meaning is usually given as something like those who have gone, or those who are finished, or the ancestors. An archaeologist asked in effect who built all this, and got back an answer that meant the people who came before, and the name stuck. Now that name has caused a very persistent and very wrong idea. Because if you call a people the ones who vanished, everybody starts imagining an empty desert, and a total disappearance and some kind of mystery. That is not what happened, and this matters. The Accomal Hohokam and the Tohono O'odham, who live in southern and central Arizona right now in the present day, are descendants of these people. The Accomal Hohokam name means river people. They were farming and irrigating along those same rivers when the Spanish arrived, and they were farming there when the Americans arrived. And they are there today. The people did not vanish. The civilization did. Those are two completely different events. and keeping them separate is the key to understanding everything that follows. So what did that civilization actually look like? Most of what we know comes from a place called Snaketown on the Gila River, south of modern Phoenix. It was excavated starting in the 1930s by an archaeologist named Emil Horry, and then again in the 1960s, and it is the site that made this whole culture legible to us. Snaketown was occupied for well over 1,000 years. Think about that in comparison to anything in modern America. There are trash mounds at that site so deep that digging down through them is like reading a book from the last page backwards, layer by layer, century by century. And what came out of those layers was a picture of a settled, sophisticated, deeply connected society. They lived in houses built in shallow pits with wooden frames and walls of brush plastered with mud arranged around open courtyards. Extended families shared a courtyard. Groups of courtyards made a village. Groups of villages shared a canal. Groups of canals shared a river. They farmed corn, beans, squash, and cotton. Cotton is a real signal, by the way, because cotton is not food. Growing cotton means you have enough surplus food that you can afford to use land and water on something you are going to weave and wear and trade. They wove it well. Hohokam cotton textiles moved a long way. They harvested the desert too, not just the fields. Saguaro cactus fruit, mesquite pods, agave, which they cultivated deliberately on rocky ground where nothing else would grow. They were not merely surviving in the Sonoran Desert. They had it fully mapped. They made pottery buff-colored with red designs, and the designs are alive in a way that is hard to describe. Rows of tiny running figures, birds, dancers, whole processions circling a bowl, and they traded enormously. Marine shell from the Gulf of California, roughly 200 miles away across brutal country, shows up at their sites in huge quantities. They carved it into bracelets and pendants and rings, and those bracelets show up all over the Southwest, which means they were not just importing shell, they were manufacturing shell jewelry and exporting it. Copper bells came up from Mesoamerica, and so did macaws. Living scarlet macaws carried more than 1,000 miles north from the tropics into the desert alive, because somebody wanted them enough to make that work. And then there is the etching. The Hohokam took shell, covered part of it in pitch or resin in a design, and soaked the whole thing in fermented saguaro fruit juice, which is mildly acidic. The acid ate away the exposed shell and left the protected design standing up in relief. Then they peeled off the covering. That is etching, actual acid etching, and they were doing it somewhere around 1,000 years ago, which by most accounts makes it one of the earliest known etching processes anywhere in the world, centuries before European metalworkers were doing anything similar. And then there are the ball courts. Across the Hohokam region, archaeologists have identified more than 200 large oval depressions with raised earthen sides. They look unmistakably like the ball courts of Mesoamerica, the ones associated with the great ritual ball games of Mexico and Central America. For roughly 400 years, from about 750 to about 1150, these courts were everywhere. Villages built them. Some villages had more than one, and they seem to have been the connective tissue of the whole society. A place where different villages came together, competed, traded, arranged marriages, settled disputes, and reinforced the relationships that kept a shared canal system functioning. If you want to know how hundreds of villages cooperated on 1,000 miles of canal, the ball courts are a very large part of the answer. Then, around the year 1150, they stopped using them, all of them, across the entire region. And here's where the story turns. If you are enjoying this one, drop a comment with the name of your city, and I will tell you what is buried underneath it. Because what replaced the ball courts tells you that something fundamental had changed. Starting around 1150, the Hohokam entered what archaeologists call the Classic Period. And the Classic Period is when the architecture changes character completely. The ball courts go quiet. In their place, communities start building platform mounds. These are large, flat-topped rectangular structures of packed earth and rubble, some of them huge, and on top of them they built buildings. Then they put walls around the whole thing called compound walls, enclosing the mound and the structures on it. Walls are a message. Ball courts are open. Anyone can gather at a ball court. Anyone can watch. A walled compound on a raised platform is the opposite of that. It says there is an inside and an outside, and you are on the outside. So somewhere in the 12th century, this society appears to shift from something relatively open and horizontal to something more layered, with a smaller group of people living physically above and behind walls, and everyone else below. Why does that happen? The honest answer is that archaeologists argue about it, and the evidence supports more than one story. Population pressure is one candidate. competition over water is another, and a strong one, because by this point the valley is full and the river is fully committed. Once every drop of the salt river is already spoken for, the only way for anyone to get more water is to take it from someone else. Systems under that kind of pressure tend to grow hierarchies, and they tend to grow walls, and in this period they built the most striking thing they ever built. South of Phoenix, in a place now called Casa Grande Ruins, they raised a structure that is unlike anything else in the region. 4 stories tall. Walls of caliche mud laid up in courses, in some places more than 4 feet thick at the base. It was built somewhere around the middle of the 1300s. It is one of the largest ancient structures in North America. It has no obvious defensive purpose. It has no obvious practical purpose either. Nobody appears to have lived in it in an ordinary way, but it has holes in the upper walls, and those holes are not random. Certain openings line up with the sun at the summer solstice. Others appear to align with lunar events, including the extremes of a cycle that takes over 18 years to complete. Think about what that requires. To notice a cycle that takes 18.5 years, you need records. You need people watching the sky generation after generation, passing on measurements. You need to have been watching for a very long time before you can even detect the pattern, let alone build a wall that predicts it. They put an observatory in the desert aligned to the sky in mud, and it is still standing. When the first Europeans finally saw it, they had no idea what it was. A Jesuit missionary named Eusebio Francisco Kino reached it in 1694 and gave it the name it still has, Casa Grande, the Great House. But by the time Kino stood in front of it, it had already been empty for well over 200 years. Because somewhere in the 1400s, the whole thing came apart. Here is what the evidence suggests, and I want to walk through it carefully, because this is not a mystery in the way people usually mean it. It is not unexplained. It is just uncomfortable. The Salt River is not a gentle river. It drains a huge area of mountains, and when those mountains get a heavy winter or a fast melt, the river does not rise politely. It comes down hard. Remember what the canal system depends on. At the very top of every canal there is an intake, the point where the channel takes water off the river. That intake has to sit at exactly the right height relative to the river surface. A few feet too high and no water enters. That is the entire system, balanced on that one relationship. In the 1300s, the river started behaving badly. Tree rings and flood deposits point to a series of very large floods, with a particularly severe one in the year 1358, and more after it. A flood that size does 2 things. In the short term, it smashes the intakes, tears out the headworks, and dumps enormous quantities of sand into the channels. That is bad, but that is survivable. These people had been repairing flood damage for centuries. They knew how. The second thing is the one that kills you. A flood that violent can cut the riverbed itself deeper. The river scours down into its own channel and settles at a lower level than before. Geologists call this entrenchment. And when the river drops, every single intake along it is suddenly stranded, sitting up on the bank, above the water, useless. The canals are perfect, the fields are perfect, the engineering is perfect, and nothing flows. To fix that, you cannot just repair the intake. You have to move it, sometimes miles upstream, to find a point where the new lower river surface is high enough to feed the canal again, which means digging new upper channels, which means the largest construction effort in the history of the valley, needed immediately in an emergency by a population that is currently having a very bad harvest, and they may have tried. There is evidence of canal rebuilding in this period. But the floods did not come once, they came repeatedly, and in between them the tree rings suggest drought. So the pattern is roughly this: devastating flood, enormous emergency rebuild. Poor years, another flood, another rebuild with fewer people, less food in storage, and less reason to believe the next one will hold. Now go back to the thing I asked you to hold on to. This system was never really about dirt, it was about agreement. Hundreds of villages cooperating across generations, doing miserable maintenance work on the shared belief that everyone else would do theirs. Trust like that is built slowly and spent quickly. Every failed harvest is a reason for a village to look after itself first. Every emergency rebuild that fails again the following year makes the next call for shared labor a little harder to answer. And once enough communities decide the collective project is not worth their labor, the collective project does not exist anymore. No matter how good the engineering is, there may have been more going on. Some researchers point to salt building up in soils that had been irrigated for a very long time, slowly poisoning the fields. Some point to signs of malnutrition and disease in skeletal remains from the late period. Some point to internal conflict. But the shape of it is clear enough. The environment struck the system hard and repeatedly, at exactly the point where it was most fragile, and the society that had absorbed those blows for 1,000 years finally could not absorb another one. By around the year 1450, the great villages were empty. The platform mounds were abandoned. Casa Grande was standing alone in the desert with nobody in it. The people did not die out. They dispersed. They broke into smaller groups, moved to places along the rivers where a much smaller and simpler irrigation system could be maintained by a village on its own, and they kept going. That is the ancestral link to the Hohokam. It was not extinction. It was a controlled abandonment of a way of life that had become impossible. And then the desert did what deserts do. Wind filled the channels. Brush grew over the banks. Mud walls slumped and rounded. 400 years passed, which brings us back to Jack Swilling sitting on a horse in 1867, looking at long straight depressions in the ground. Everything I have just told you was in front of him. He could not read any of it. What he saw was free infrastructure. And I want to be precise about this, because it is the single best fact in the entire story. The early canals of modern Phoenix were not merely inspired by the Hohokam canals. In multiple cases they were the Hohokam canals. Crews went in, cleared out centuries of sand and mesquite from an existing channel, repaired the banks, and let the river in. The water followed a path chosen by an engineer who had been dead for 500 years. Several of the major modern canals in the valley still run on lines that were laid out in antiquity. Enlarged, concrete-lined, tied into dams and pumps and a modern water utility, but running where the ancient ones ran. You can drive across one this afternoon. And then there is the name. The story usually goes that the naming was suggested by an eccentric Englishman in the settlement, a man called Darrell Duppa, who is supposed to have looked at the situation and observed that a new city was rising here on the ruins of an old one, and that it should therefore be called Phoenix. Some accounts credit other members of the settlement instead, and the details are murky in the way that frontier stories usually are, but whoever said it first, the meaning was understood by everyone there. They named the city after the bird that burns down and comes back, because they knew, standing in those dry channels, that they were not the first ones. They just did not know who the first ones were. They named a city in honor of a civilization they could not identify. Now I have to tell you the last part because the story does not end on a nice note, and leaving it out would be dishonest. Downstream from the Salt River is the Gila River, and along the Gila lived the Accomal O'odham, the river people, direct descendants of the builders, and in the 1800s they were doing extremely well. They were, by every contemporary account, excellent farmers. They irrigated from the Gila using the knowledge they had carried forward. They grew large surpluses of wheat. When American settlers came through, when the 49ers crossed on their way to California, when the United States Army needed to supply its posts in the region, it was the Accomal O'odham who fed them. They sold millions of pounds of grain. They were the breadbasket of that entire territory, and they were prosperous. And they had done it by farming the desert the way their ancestors had. And then settlers moved in upstream on the upper Gila, and began diverting the river for their own fields. The water going past the O'odham fields dropped. Then it dropped further. Then, in dry years, the Gila stopped reaching them at all. What followed is remembered as the years of famine. A community that had fed an entire territory could not feed itself. Crops failed. People went hungry. A farming culture that had been continuous in that valley for well over 1,000 years was broken, not by flood, not by drought, but by the fact that the water was taken upstream by people with a legal system that recognized their claim and not the O'odhams. That is the part that makes the Phoenix story land properly. The ancient civilization did not fall because of anything anyone did to it. It fell because a river moved. But their descendants, farming the same water with the same knowledge, were dried out on purpose by policy. It took more than a century to begin to address. In the year 2004, after decades of legal fighting, the United States Congress passed a water settlement that restored substantial water rights to the Gila River Indian community. It was one of the largest such settlements in American history. Water came back to fields that had been dry for generations, and today the community farms them again. So here is where all of it stands. If you go to Phoenix right now, you can visit a platform mound in the middle of the city, minutes from the international airport. For most of its modern life it was known as Pueblo Grande. In 2023 it was renamed the Sede Vaki Museum, using Hohokam words rather than Spanish ones, which is a small thing and also not a small thing at all. Right next to it is a preserved section of the ancient canal intakes, at a spot called the Park of Four Waters, where you can stand in a canal that was dug before the Norman conquest of England. Look up and see planes landing. South of the city, Casa Grande still stands, sheltered under a steel roof built in the 1930s to stop the rain from finishing it off. It was one of the first archaeological sites the United States ever set aside for protection, back in 1892, and every year when construction crews dig foundations in that valley, they find more. Freeway work has cut through ancient canals. Light rail construction has exposed them. Housing developments turn up village sites. The city keeps discovering the city underneath it, one excavation at a time. But the main monument is not any of those places. The main monument is the water itself. Somewhere in the Salt River Valley this afternoon, water is moving through a channel toward a field or a park or a neighborhood. It is following a gradient of about a foot per mile, because that is the only gradient that works. It is going where it is going because a very long time ago, a group of people with sticks and baskets and no metal and no wheel and no animals figured out exactly where the water had to go, and then organized themselves well enough to make it happen, and held that organization together for something like 1,000 years. They lost it in the end. The river took it back, but the line they drew is still there. Millions of people depend on it every day without knowing whose line it is. That is what is under Phoenix. Not ruins, not a lost city. A working piece of infrastructure that outlived the civilization that built it, went silent for 400 years, and was switched back on by people who had no idea what they were switching on. The city really is named correctly.